Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be going over databases and an overview of some database concepts that'll be really important for us in our web application development. So again, we can't deep dive into this because there's like courses and multiple sequence of courses devoted to data and databases. So I just want to do enough of an overview to get us started technically interacting with databases in our web applications. So that'll be the difference here. We won't become like database gurus from this, but just enough for us to get some terminology under our belts so that we can have uh, communication about it in up and coming lectures. So let's begin. First thing I want to do is note some common database servers that you might come across. MySQL is an open source database. They have a commercial version too that's owned by Oracle. So again, that comes probably with the tech support and um, extra documentation, all that kind of stuff. But there's just an open source version you can download and use right away. Very popular in the web application world. Another one is PostgreSQL. This one is fully open source, more enterprise features built into this. So a lot of stored procedures, a lot of extra scalable type of things that are built into it as well. And yeah, really, really powerful database. And I tend to, and this is kind of just my own little thing, I tend to use PostgreSQL for most of my work nowadays. So I highly, highly recommend it. But MySQL works awesome and fast as well. So you're going to be fine either way. There's Microsoft SQL Server if you're in the Microsoft world, which super powerful enterprise database and a great integration in with Microsoft tools, which is going to work really well for you. IBM DB2, again, more of a vertical, high vertical database, highly scalable, super powerful, and you would find yourself using that in very high-end enterprise applications. And same with Oracle. Oracle's large database. I just recently read an article that Zoom, the video conference software, uses Oracle for their database on their backend. So highly ingrained in the tech world as well. So let's take a look at this picture. I've talked about web application architecture in other lectures, but I wanted to focus on it again and keep in mind just on where we're at. And in this particular class, we've focused more on the right side where we have our logic in PHP, but it could be in JavaScript, Python, or Java, any backend application, and that's the server-side applications that we're building. But there's also the database part, and that's the part I want to focus on specifically to get us geared in and narrowed and dialed into what we're actually dealing with and where it fits in the big picture. So you have the front end user interacting with your front end, and that's where your HTML, CSS, JavaScript is, which is requesting information from the back end, and that information is going to come from the database. So the front end code and the back end code are stateless, meaning they don't hold state. They basically just transfer state back and forth. And it's the database which is preserving the state for you. And so that's why it's so important to understand how your database works, how to save data, how to read it, how to update it, delete it, etc. So that's where it fits within this big picture. And so that's why it's important to actually cover the database before you start interacting and displaying information from and to it. It'll just kind of help to give you that concept of where it's coming from. So let's zoom that picture up even further. The middle blue section is our database, but a database really is just made up of many tables and many tables that are related. So I could have a table of users, I could have a table of products, I could have a table of locations if you're tracking locations of stores or whatever. I could have product details. So I can have a table of products, maybe some general info, but then you got details about each product in another table. You could have a table of accounts where users actually have login information. And so it's just an example of what type of tables you might hold in a database. But you can be part of projects that could have hundreds of tables. That's not uncommon, especially as projects grow. It's very common to see a database full of many, many, many tables. And so in a table now, you're going to, this would be like a table with various columns or fields, you might call them. So for example, I have an ID which uniquely identifies each record. And then there's also a name column and a price column. And so if you've worked with spreadsheets at all, you'll see this type of row column type of layout. But in the database world, these have very, very specific names. So you have an ID, a name, price, any custom type of column that you need, and then each row is called a record. Cool. So with our database and our tables and our records, we need to be able to interact and query our data in such a fashion that is going to benefit us for our web applications, right? So database operations. And we're going to be dealing with this acronym called CRUD. And so you hear this acronym used a lot when interacting with data. And all it stands for is the ability to create, read, update, and delete, which are your four most common database operations. So let's go ahead and walk through how we might query our database in using these four operations as context. So in order to interact with your database, it's good to be familiar with a domain-specific language called SQL or SQL, which is a structured query language. And this is like your most low-level language to interact with almost all the databases I listed on that earlier slide. What's cool is that once you learn SQL, you can use it on those other databases. There's actually a industry standard on what this language should look like. So that's why you can take this skill wherever you go. Let's say you switch jobs and they switch databases, or they use a different database, you know SQL, so that just works. So very, very powerful skill to have. So let's walk through some of the basics of SQL. We can't deep dive again, but again, just so you can say you've seen it, we know we can use the same terminology moving forward. So the first one is create. And so this top level example is the syntax, and then the bottom section is an example. So we have an insert into the table name, and then you reference your columns and then the values for that column. So the example on the bottom is we're going to insert into users, the users table, name and age, values, Neo, and 99. Okay. Next one is read. So you use a select statement. So select and then the columns you want, from which table, and then where a condition. So the pointy bracket is just a placeholder for the actual value that goes there. So I use it, for example, table name and condition. And then the example down at the bottom is using the select statement. So select name age from the users table where name equals Neo. So I'm going to find that record and select the values from it so that I can display that somewhere. Okay, update. So this one's a little bit more involved, but again, I think you can follow it. So we want to use the update statement. So update this table, set these columns. So there's column 1, value 1, column 2, value 2, where a specific condition. So the example down below is update the users table, set name to Trinity, where name equals Neo. So basically, we're going to find this record that has a name of Neo and update the name to Trinity is what we're doing here. Okay. The next one is delete. So this uses the delete statement. So delete from the table where specific condition. So delete from users where name equals Smith. So that'll go and find the name, the record or records where name is Smith, and delete that record or records. Okay, so that's kind of an overview on SQL. There's so much more, of course, but what I want to do next is talk about Eloquent ORM. And this is an object relational mapper which incorporates the active record pattern. So this will use PHP code to interact with our database. And so it'll give us a nice PHP syntax to basically construct the SQL for us. And then it executes that SQL against the database and gives the data back in a nice PHP fashion. So let's go through all those operations, CRUD operations, and see how they would look in Eloquent, the Eloquent ORM. So, or EM for the Eloquent model syntax. So notice what we're doing now is we're going to create a user. So we'll instantiate a user. We will set the name on the user, and then we'll just save. So that's basically the equivalent of that insert statement that we saw in SQL, but it puts it into a nice object-oriented syntax for us as programmers to get it done quickly and easily. Also notice the app/user, right? So that's basically a user that we've declared and that we can use in our code, just like any other object that we've defined in our code. So that's why I think it's super powerful that you understand how objects are set up, declared, and used in your own code, so that when you go to use something like Eloquent, it looks really, really similar, or looks very, very, something like you've used before. So let's go ahead and move over to the read. And so there's a couple different things I can do here. I can grab all the users. So there's a : all method I can call on user, which will select all the users from the database. Or I can get really specific on just finding one user. So I can get me a user where name is Neo and go ahead and get that and assign it to a variable called a user. And then we can interact with that just like a regular object. Okay, let's go to update. So update, what I can do is I can find a user. So I need to actually retrieve that. So that'll do a select. So that's basically a select from users where ID equals 1 is what that find statement is doing. And that'll retrieve it, put it into an object. And then I can update the name to Trinity and save that. And save that will actually go ahead and do an update statement on that record. It's pretty cool. And finally, we have a delete. And so a delete, what I do here is I go do a select, I find that user, and then I call delete on that object. And then Eloquent will go run that delete command, delete from users where ID equals 1. It'll go through and delete that from the database. So very, very powerful. And depending on the project that you're on, you may be writing SQL, but you also may be using an ORM. It just depends on the project, who the tech lead is for the project. I would say that ORMs are pretty handy. They're for working within a project, but it's kind of the 80-20 rule, right? It'll do most of what you need to do in a very easy fashion, but there's that 20% where you need to fine tune or optimize a query. And that's where going down to the lower level and writing it in SQL comes in really, really handy. And you can optimize your SQL statements. And so that's why I think you need to know both, just to accommodate for that 80-20 thing. Because there's just times you're gonna have to just drop down to that lower level and either fix something, make it faster, make it better, or something. So definitely it's not one or the other. You need to know both, and that's why I'm talking about both. So another thing I want to talk about is like table creation or managing tables. And so the top syntax is the SQL statement to or syntax. So there's a create table statement, table name, and then your columns and your data types. And so you see an example down below where I have create table users, ID as an integer, and a primary key. So that primary key makes it really special. That has to be unique. It's like auto incrementing from 1 to n plus 1 as far as every time there's a new record, it'll just add 1 to the ID. Um, and then your name, which is a text value, and age, which is an integer. So when you create your table, you have to specify a little bit more detail, and that way the database can maintain the integrity of the data as you submit information into it. So that's something that we'll be doing. Another concept I want to talk about is migrations, which is version control for your database. So it allows you to create and modify and delete your database table schema. And like the create SQL statement from the slide before, here's the exact same version in a Laravel migration. So you actually use the schema create, give it the user's name, use this library called Blueprint, which creates, will allow you to use the syntax, and then I specify the ID, the string, or the name and the integer, and that'll basically create that create table SQL statement for me, and then run that against the database to create a table. What's also cool about migrations is that it allows you to manage your tables and make changes, updates, and if something's not right, you can roll it back. So super powerful, very, very cool. This is definitely a feature we'll definitely take advantage of for sure. Another thing we're going to take advantage of is seeding our data. And what's great about this is that let's say you have an application that you're writing and you're writing a CRUD application. So you're in the web app and you're filling out a form just to create a user, and you're editing the user, and you don't want to manually go through and create data on your web page just to get a large sample size. It's really handy to be able to seed your data up front. So I could have like 1,000 users in my application right off the bat, and then I can test more real world scenarios. How does my application respond if I have 10,000 users in it? Is it going to choke? Is it going to blow up? The seeding is a great way to do that. So here's the syntax for that. You can use this DB table users and insert. And I can put that statement within a loop like 100 times and create a statement or create that many users like really, really fast. And so we'll probably be doing that as well. And so that'll allow us to set up some pagination type things, so we can paginate through users like 10 at a time or 20 at a time. That way we don't display all of our users on one page and kind of choke that one page. So this will come in handy for some good testing of our applications. So wrapping up, I hope you were able to kind of get an overview of database, table, fields, records, SQL, the Eloquent ORM, migrations, seeding our database. Very important concepts that we'll be working with more concretely in up and coming lectures, but just had to get some of the jargon out of the way first. And I hope this was a great introduction to you. So we'll go more in detail on some of those concepts in up and coming lectures. Till next time, have a good one.